Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation to the James Martin Center, and especially to you, Jeff, for exactly we knew each other for a long time, and we talked several times that it would be a great thing to come here and see your workplace finally. So I'm really glad we finally made it happen this time, and to visit it even if just for a very brief time and for a couple of hours. So it's a big pleasure for me. Okay, generally in what I do, I'm dealing with nuclear weapons, in world politics, international norms is something that interests me a lot, and political psychology. And in this research, we're kind of trying to put all these things together and use some of the methods from moral, social psychology to that could help us provide some new findings about what are the public attitudes to nuclear weapons and chemical weapons as well. So what I will be, let's see if it works.
I pointed that way, Mike. There you go.
Yeah, perfect. It works. Yeah, what I'll be presenting is a research that is a part of a broader interdisciplinary project. Partly I work there with my colleague Marek Branka in Prague, and also with Scott Sagan at Stanford. Some of it I will present is already written as a paper, and some of it is still like very preliminary results, and I'm very happy to discuss them. So I will really try to make it as brief as possible and actually get some feedback from you, or maybe some discussion that could actually help us to incorporate these ideas into new papers. I told Jeff that I was recently at Brown and Yale, and we had some really good meetings there where people actually gave us some ideas we never thought of, and it was quite refreshing to get it from other people. Sometimes when you are stuck working on something, you just need to get out of your small space and to get some fresh ideas. So let me start with a research that we have done last year, and it's currently under review in a journal. I'm sure that many people here are familiar with one of the major puzzles in our field, and that is why nuclear weapons have not been used in military conflicts since the Second World War. This is very intriguing issue. Since 1945, nuclear armed powers manufactured over 120,000 nuclear weapons and bombs and warheads. Many of these weapons have been deployed, assigned to delivery systems, ready for military use under very elaborated operational plans. And also many of these states with nuclear weapons found themselves in protracted hostile relationships with other states, fought wars in which the use of nuclear weapons would actually provide them with some military advantage, even lost some of these wars. And yet we will soon celebrate 75 years since the first and today only military use of nuclear weapons. So many of you are probably also familiar with Nina Tannenwald from Brown University and her excellent work on the subject, where she discusses the role of very powerful international norm, the nuclear taboo, that basically sets aside nuclear weapons as a very special kind of horrific weapons and make their use virtually unthinkable in world politics. We just have a new special issue being made with Nina and Scott that should come out sometimes this year about generally reinvigorating this whole research agenda. So that's something that I'll be happy to share with you as soon as it's ready. And there are also other scholars like T.V. Paul who are basically claiming that non-use is something more of a prudent and much more fragile tradition that has gradually developed in the strategic interaction among nuclear armed states. And recently, Scott Sagan and his colleagues, Daryl Press and Benjamin Valentino, came up with some new research on the subject in which they studied public attitudes to the nuclear weapons. And these findings made quite a big splash in the community of nuclear weapons scholars, because they suggested that, at least in the case of the United States, this atomic aversion is much lower than one would expect if nuclear taboo would indeed be a thing, and that many people actually don't have such a big problem with approving the use of nuclear weapons under certain conditions. This research has been criticized a lot.
Okay.
So, it's sometimes catchy, but not always. Okay.
Is that where you want to be?
Yeah.
Okay.
This research has been criticized a lot, but I found it very interesting, very intriguing in many aspects. And there were basically two things that I wanted to find out more about. First, since I'm very interested in social psychology, what I wanted to know is a bit more about what kind of people are those who actually approve the use of nuclear weapons, and what kind of people are those who are against it. What set aside the people that have no such a big moral issue with basically killing, hundreds, thousands, or millions of people in some scenarios, and who are those who are like very much averse to this idea. What we decided to do is a theory from moral psychology that basically says that during evolution, all people have developed 5 basic blocks of morality. These 5 are related to concerns about harm that is caused to others, about fairness, about loyalty to one's own group, about respect for authority, and about social purity. The first of these 2 foundations, care and harm, fairness, cheating, we call individualizing foundations, and they are about behaviors that basically can harm or benefit individuals among us. And the remaining 3, which we call binding moral foundations, are more related to well-being of larger groups and are usually more developed in Eastern cultures and more religious and conservative people. The important thing is that even if all people are basically born with predisposition for all these 5 moral foundations, these foundations are eventually modified by differences in personal characteristics, with individual experiences that people have in their lives, with cultural influences during their socialization, with the way that your parents actually raised you. And that means that everyone actually differs in sensitivity to each of these foundations and have developed some more of them, some of them more and some of them less. For example, for some people, respect for authority is a really important moral value and they live by this foundation, and for other people they don't even perceive it as a moral issue, or they even rebel against it, which is something that many people who have kids, teenagers probably know. So,
can you give a few names behind this theory, behind this?
Well, probably the most famous one is Jonathan Haidt. He's the one who made it most famous. If you go to YouTube and go to TED Talk, he has some really nice, very simple TED Talk where he explains, how they are working on it. It's a huge interdisciplinary research with thousands and thousands of studies, done in all countries around the world. Basically, what I heard, he's the most famous one, but there's been truly impressive work done in his research team by other of his colleagues. So many of these publications are actually co-authored. But I would say that Jonathan Haidt is the one.
There is a lot of study in neuroscience about efforts to locate in the brain.
Exactly. Yeah, for example, the research that we do is usually done with questionnaires, with online questionnaires. But I know people who are trying some more ambitious studies who are trying to, for example, follow the eye movements to see how people react to different things, or even what you suggested with functional MRI studies, when people actually lock you down and try to locate which of the parts of your brain light up once you, for example, show you some transgressions to some more values and what it does to your brain. And people do react very differently, with some people reacting to something as being like a moral issue and being very, very much agitated by it, and some people just simply don't light up. So yeah. Okay, so this was one thing that we really wanted to try. The second one was was to try what would happen if we do the same studies with chemical weapons or similar kind of scenarios, which are other types of horrific weapons that we consider to be immoral weapons of mass destruction. This is especially important right now when chemical weapons have been repeatedly used in Syria, and we kind of believe it's about time we discuss a little bit more what how these nuclear and chemical taboos are developing somehow in parallel. I mean, there's a very famous 1990s studies when Richard Price and Nina Tannenwald actually wrote a piece together about nuclear and chemical weapons taboo. But it's pretty old. Since then, I actually haven't seen much work that would be really going into the mechanisms behind these two and studying them in parallel. And it's very much time for it. So, not sure.
Let me see if I bring you the get you the keyboard and then we can drive by hand. Let me look down arrow there and see if that works better.
Yeah, that works better. Okay, so what we did was that we designed two experimental studies among American public that partly replicated what Scott Sagan and his colleagues did previously. And well, what we did was that we divided our participants into three groups. We gave them some fictional scenarios about US attack on a terrorist camp in Afghanistan. And these scenarios and how they played out were completely the same, including number of fatalities, etc. Except in one of them, the United States used massive conventional airstrike, in one of them it used chemical weapons, and one of them it used nuclear weapons. We were interested in finding out about how much participants approved of the operation and asked them a battery of different socio-demographical questions about their education, political orientation, income, etc. And finally, we also gave them the moral foundation questionnaire, which is like an established way of how to measure these moral foundations with people, with like many questions concerning each of these foundations, and to measure scores in individual moral foundations and how they differ. So there were several interesting findings. I will just present some of it. If someone would be interested in reading it before the paper is published, I'm very happy to, if you email me, and I will be happy to share the paper with you. When it comes to like rough numbers about how people actually approve the strikes, we found that people, similar like Sagan and his colleagues, found out that people are more supportive of conventional airstrikes, which is something that is to be expected, with 65% approving the strikes. But similar to Scott, we also found that there is still a very large number of individuals that approve the use of nuclear weapons in this scenario, about 50% of people, which is something that usually comes quite shocking to many people who believe that nuclear weapons is something that would be that many people consider to be completely unusable weapon or something out of reality. So in this case, it was like 50% of the people who actually approved it. In comparison, people were much more, significantly more averse in statistical language to the use of chemical weapons, where the support dropped to about 40%, which is...
What kind of group you chose? What was the population of the people that you asked those questions? Who were they?
Who were they? It was a sample that was provided by Amazon Mechanical Turk. It's not completely representative sample, but with the studies that we that was trying to match how representative is with representative samples, it actually fits pretty well. It's a little bit leaning towards a little bit more liberal population, I would say, a little bit younger people, but not that much. So it's not completely representative study, but fairly close to U.S. population, American public.
Yeah, Michal's not talking very much about his methodology, but this has become actually a very popular research technique in U.S. social science to use an online service to administer surveys to a randomly chosen sample of the population, and then build into the survey an experimental treatment. So one half of the sample gets one question, the other half of the sample gets a different question, then you see if they're different.
Yeah, from the point of methodology, the point is, when we call it experimental, that means that we are basically always trying to keep everything the same and just to change one thing for each group to see if this one thing makes a difference.
And this was all a US sample, right?
Yes, this was so far a US sample, It's we have a plan to do in a very short time a similar survey in India, which is quite challenging. Scott has some very bad experience with trying to get data from India, and he did try it, and eventually he decided that the data is not very reliable and that they didn't publish the study. So we are going to try it again and see if we actually are able to get some reliable data about how Indian population thinks about these similar issues. So this is some of our goals for the very near future. But it's very convenient to do it in US because there is a good sample of people to work with. There are established prestigious companies, and of course, if you want to publish something, it's usually quite.
And it was outsourced. You didn't do it, but you hired somebody else to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, there will be some new studies that Scott has been doing in some other countries. There's including UK, France, Israel. I just read the paper that he wrote for this one. It's quite interesting, and many of these findings pretty much hold.
I think Scott gave that talk here.
Yeah.
He did? Okay, so you know what he was talking about. Okay, so what we also found was a very strong relationship between the moral foundation of individuals and their willingness to approve the strikes. Generally, people who we found that score high on these individuals and foundations were less likely to approve the strike, and people who score high on binding foundations are more likely to approve it. And this was valid actually for all three types of strike almost equally: nuclear, chemical, and conventional. That means that yes, generally most people preferred conventional weapons over nuclear and prefer nuclear over chemical, but quite consistently, the higher you were, you were in these individualizing foundations, the more against you were to any type of these strikes, and the higher you were on these binding foundations, you were actually much more approving of these strikes. So we were able to statistically confirm that we have quite good predictors to measure some kind of hawkishness of individuals and their willingness to approve the strikes. And it also led us to one interesting question, if attitudes to these strikes are related to moral foundations of individuals, we got an idea that we could perhaps use moral argumentation and moral reframing to change these attitudes, to alter them somehow in another study. This is a very interesting area of research in moral psychology that we have been intrigued by for quite some time. Experiments basically found that if you believe that something is morally right or wrong, it is almost impossible to change your mind with rational argumentation. It's very hard, if you believe that something is ethical and moral to have someone and show you some numbers and statistics and convince you with rational arguments. But there's a lot of studies also that show that if you reframe the problem in moral terms and give it, different twist that resonates with your moral foundations, it's possible to change your attitude and to look at the problem from a different perspective. For example, there are some studies in social psychology that show that if you present the problem of environmental protection, green policies as a patriotic thing that protects your homeland from pollution, many conservative people with high binding foundation are suddenly much more supportive of green policies when you ask them than if you frame it as a global problem for individuals that is impacting people all around the world. Suddenly you are presenting the very same policies but just give it a little bit different frame and using a little bit different moral argumentation why it's a right thing to do it, why it's a right thing to accept them. So we basically wanted to see if we are also, if we do another study, if we are able to change people's attitudes, if we try to do a different moral framing. So we did a new experimental study on nuclear disarmament, in which we divided our participants into two experimental groups. One of them received a nuclear disarmament advocacy text from international NGO ICANN. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. We basically used the text that they are using themselves, and it was calling for nuclear disarmament because of humanitarian concerns, impact of individuals around the world, suffering of individuals, etc. They also received a picture of Hiroshima victim, and generally we try to give this individualizing framing, the one that they are already using in their NGO work. And the other group received an advocacy text for nuclear disarmament from an organization called American Veterans for Nuclear Disarmament, which we made up. They also called for nuclear disarmament, but framed it, they propagated the same policies, but framed them differently. They framed them as a patriotic duty and policy that will protect our people, from nuclear attack by terrorists or nuclear accident. And generally, we put there some picture of Ronald Reagan, etc. And generally, we try to give it, this kind of binding frame, more conservative binding frame that would be, more about our in-group or American in-group. Generally, there were also moral arguments, but from a different, binding perspective. And then we presented them with 4 different policies related to nuclear disarmament, such as support for further reductions of nuclear arsenal, comprehensive test ban treaty, and some other things. Generally, nuclear disarmament, like a global abolition. And we also, once again, asked them about their socio-demographic background and measured their psychological characteristics. And the overall effect that we found was that the binding framing is slightly more persuasive. That is, when we use the binding framing, people tended to support disarmament policies more than without it. By binding, I mean the one with American veterans. But it was even more interesting when we divided the people in groups according to their political orientation, and where we found a significant interaction between ideology and frame persuasiveness. This binding framing, the one with American veterans, works equally well almost for everyone, while the individual framing underperforms for conservatives and overperforms for liberals. That means, conservatives actually found it, not very convincing and were rating the nuclear policies lower, and liberals were, it was working on liberals as a persuasive frame. And this kind of suggests that that some of the disarmament NGOs, or there's an idea behind this, or that we would propose that some disarmament NGOs are advocating their policies in a way which is not necessarily the most effective. It does not morally resonate with people that they should be mainly trying to convince. It usually resonates very well with people who are already quite well convinced, like many liberal people who would be already supportive of these policies, and the way they are framing the issue is resonating with them. But with people who are a little bit more skeptical about arms control, disarmament, and are more conservative, are actually found these arguments counterproductive. It underperforms for them. But if you twist it and actually use this more conservative framing, and you find out that people on the liberal scale who are more supportive of disarmament, arms control, are basically still supportive of disarmament, but you are also getting more support from people who are generally more skeptical towards it. And this framing is actually performs better, and it's reaching out to people who actually you need to convince in a way. And there were some other interesting findings regarding psychology, but we don't have so much time for it now, but we will for sure write them up in the paper. Okay. And finally, let me get back once again to our early finding that people are more averse to the use of chemical weapons than nuclear weapons. Usually when we are presenting this paper, it's almost always coming as the most surprising, interesting thing, and we always spend a lot of time discussing this, and many people have a lot of ideas about this, and many of my colleagues, we spent actually a lot of time over dinners and beers discussing this issue. And it's something that we would like to investigate in our new experimental study, which is in a very early stage, and we would like to do some focus groups. We already did a few, and we have some ideas, but we would like to do more before we actually launch the experiment. Some ideas I have why this could be the case, and some that appeared in the discussion, so they are not completely mine, but they just popped out. Were the following. One idea is the time that already passed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the experience. It's been 1940s. For most people, when they are thinking about nuclear weapons, they are looking at footage, which is very old, and it's very hard to emotionally connect with things that happened in the 1940s. Comparing to, for example, images of Syria, where you can see in live TV on CNN people being killed by gas. So this may be one of the effects. Simply that it's been a long time since nuclear weapons have been used, so people don't find them to be as horrific as chemical weapons. That was one idea. One idea is that actually, like in pop culture and computer games and some movies, nuclear weapons for many people have this kind of aspect of something like a coolness. It doesn't look as terrifying or as being as powerless as being killed by chemical weapons. There is when we talk about it in some focus groups, and when we were trying to go a little bit deeper into how people really perceive it, what are the emotions when they are speaking about these weapons, there are people who are actually fascinated by this, image of glorious death, that you imagine that you are standing in front of this big mushroom cloud, and they have this idea that they would be killed by the instant, but before they die, they actually see the most amazing thing, in their life, and they found, many people actually do find it fascinating. They find it like something special, but in comparison with being just lying on the ground, impossible to move, and being completely powerless and just dying with a very painful, horrific, and often very slow and death. So that may be one idea that people have generally about this, and this is why for some people this could be a reason why they find chemical weapons to be more, abhorrent as a weapon to be used. We have one idea about a big area of psychological research, which is about disgust sensitivity. Many researchers in social psychology are trying to find, matches between attitudes of people to different problems based on how they are sensitive to disgust. So there is some idea about how poison and radioactivity could play some role, and how disgust sensitivity could be connected with this. It's possible to measure this disgust sensitivity, so this is something we will probably also include and try to see if there would be some correlation. Many people also suggest it's about knowledge of effects, and that if people would actually know a little bit more about how nuclear weapons work, and it's not always like in Terminator movies that would be just one big shot and there would be like people killed, and they would actually know about the effects of radiation and very slow death that is followed by people who were not incinerated in the very seconds the weapon was detonated, that they would see nuclear weapons also very, very differently. So that may be another effect. But of course there may be other completely different explanation, and I would be very happy to hear if you have any ideas about what you think about it, and if you may have some suggestion that we could probably even include in our survey and used by. We still don't know completely how we will what will be included there and how we will exactly try to measure all these things. We even have some little bit wider ideas that we would like to work with some colleagues who do virtual reality studies, and they would we would actually like to try to have people to see the effects and see if how they would approach the issue if they would at least have a little bit more realistic idea about how it could look like. But this is still like something very very wild that we would like to work on. So once again, please do feel free to email me in case it would be interesting in reading some of the papers. I'm happy to share them or before they are published. And yeah, I will be very happy for any ideas and comments. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you.